Hi, welcome to Culturally and Linguistically Appropriate Evaluations, what every EI evaluator in New York City needs to know. My name is Cate Crowley, Professor of Practice here at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York, and this is Module 2, which looks at the problems with the current tests used by evaluators in early intervention in New York City. I spent last year and change looking at identifying what are the tests that people are using and then do an analysis of some of those tests. I did a series of trainings in March and April of 2016 with the New York City Department of Health, and people who didn't come to those trainings or wanted to review asked me where these were available, and that's how these modules came about. So what we learned in the first module was about current tests, what the law requires, and whether EI evaluators can evaluate children without providing test scores to determine eligibility, and the answer is yes, they can. If you look in Module 2, you'll see the language that we've received directly from the New York City Department of Health that was approved by the New York State Department of Health. Our overall goal is to improve the New York City Department of Health EI evaluations with a focus on ensuring that all children receive culturally and linguistically appropriate evaluations. We're not talking about a particular population. We're saying every child has a culture, every child has a linguistic background, and we want to make sure they all receive culturally and linguistically appropriate evaluations in early intervention. It's a new day. So the training is based on the law, the regs, the memorandum, even the provider agreement, and I'm an attorney as well, and speech-language pathologist too. So here I'm going to leave you to read these slides. Will the Bureau of Intervention accept multidisciplinary evaluations where there's no standardized test used to establish a developmental delay? The answer is yes. Here's the language. Are evaluators required to use a standardized test for an English-speaking child? And the answer is no. If the evaluator determines that a standardized test is not appropriate for the child's culture, language, and developmental concern, or the instrument does not represent the child's developmental level, you write a written justification why you didn't use it for this particular child. So everything we're talking about here is consistent with the state regulations, the federal law, the memorandum, and research-based practice. State regs further specify that multidisciplinary evaluations must be conducted in a professional, objective fashion and must consider the unique characteristics of the child, use several sources and types of information, use appropriate instruments and procedures, it does not say tests, and be conducted in a setting conducive to ensuring accurate results, and the parent's input regarding the preferred environment should be considered. So New York City Department of Health requires that EI evaluators demonstrate evidence of quality and considered informed clinical opinion. Where do you demonstrate that? In the evaluation itself. How do you develop informed clinical opinion? Be on top of the research and understand the statistical base of any assessment material you use. Identify biases in assessment materials and in many current developmental milestones. We'll have a look at that later. Spend time assessing typically developing kids from the same age and cultural linguistic background as the ones you evaluate in EI. And ensure that we as evaluators have a deep understanding of appropriate developmental milestones. So now we're going to look in Module 2 about the standardized and criterion reference tests that are used throughout the New York City Department of Health early intervention, the problems with these, and the misuse of these tests. So the first question I'd like to ask is, how can standardized and criterion reference tools tell us what to expect at a specific month or 3-month range when the clinical practice guidelines do not? Now, the clinical practice guidelines do the 3 months range, birth through 12 months, but after that it's a 6-month range, and at 24 to 36 months, it's a 12-month range. How do these standardized tests come up and say a specific month? They of course cannot. There is no specific 26-month developmental level. And when a test gives that, you have to seriously question the test. And then you're likely using age equivalents, and you can look at any book on assessment and learn how problematical those are. Why can't we continue to qualify with the approved tests? Well, we're going to have a look at that now. Appropriate evaluations are more than simply counting how many words, how many sounds, how many blocks can be stacked, how many body points does a child know, how many stairs can the child climb, how many puzzle pieces, how many shapes can she put in a form board. That's what a lot of our tests are. That is not an appropriate way to assess functional levels. Words should be weighed, not counted. This is a Yiddish saying that I really like. We want to see what can this child truly do, not how many body parts do they know. So static assessment assumes that every kid coming to the evaluation has the same experiences, and all we're going to do is probe to see whether they've acquired those same experiences that everybody has. Of course, it's problematical because kids come with a great variety of different experiences. Dynamic assessment looks to see whether the child can learn new things. It's harder with young children because they may be shy. We're strangers who come to their home, the parent. But a good evaluator can elicit that kind of information through a good parent interview, even if the child is extremely shy. Current law, regs, and policies are current best practices. Now we're going to look specifically at the tests. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. It's a quote from Mark Twain. How do we find out whether a child has a disability? It's not magic. It's not the tests we pull out. So I'm going to show you a video to show you how culture affects everything, even an intraoral exam.
My uvula was cut when I was 6 years old due to recurrent tonsillitis. I couldn't heal after taking drugs. My mother was advised in the village to take me to a traditional healer. He decided to cut my uvula using a spoon and a sharp object, metallic object. Yeah. We went to his house. We entered, also to sit down, to open my mouth. He removed a metallic thing. He put it in the fire, and it was very hot. He put it in my mouth using a spoon, and then he just cut within it was very fast.
Yeah.
And then he showed me the uvula. It was painful, and then I was given very hard bread. The purpose of the hard bread was taking daily. It's because it erodes that area, it freshens that area daily so that that area will not get dead tissues, because after getting dead tissues, you get infections. I never had tonsillitis again, so people still believe it works.
So what you see here, it's a little, I'm glad we're talking to people who have a medical background because it's a little intense, but really, culture affects everything. Now I'm going to ask you a pop quiz. When developmentally can children use a thin sewing needle to string tiny beads? What do you think? A thin sewing needle to string little tiny beads. A lot of people have asked this with a bunch of people. Most people say at least 7. Some people say 14. Some people say they still can't do it. So I'm going to show you now a video that I recorded in northern Thailand to show this little 13-month-old stringing these tiny beads.
Dạ với con. Dạ.
So as you can see, even something we would think is developmental, when you can use a needle and teeny beads, that little baby was able to do it because culturally she had learned how to do it. So now we're going to talk about cultural, linguistic, and socioeconomic test biases, why informed clinical opinion is so important in EI evaluations. So Hart and Risley in 1995, and then they updated it in 2003, talked about the impact of the exposure to words based on socioeconomic status. By 3 years old, there's a 30 million word gap between the number of words children from the wealthiest families hear and the number of words children from the poorest families hear. Then Fernald, Marchman, and Weisleiter in 2013 looked at that this SES actually affects toddler vocabulary as well, which of course is what we're thinking of in EI. By 18 months, children in different socioeconomic groups displayed dramatic differences in their vocabulary. By 2 years old, the disparity has grown significantly. Now, if you'd like to look at the video by Dr. Fernald talking about this study, there's the link in YouTube. I'm going to move forward with a little more of their conclusions. They found that children from the higher socioeconomic backgrounds looked at an identified object faster and spent more time looking at the correct image. So here's some way of learning that is significantly different based on SES. At 24 months, children from the lower socioeconomic background were performing at the same level as the 18-month-old from the high socioeconomic group in both speed and accuracy. So by 18 months, we had an enormous change in the high socioeconomic group, and at 24 months, 6-month delay. The study also focused on the way children process new vocabulary. Here, too, children from homes with low incomes lag behind children of the same age who are growing up in more affluent circumstances. So since 2003, we know that if we're using a lot of vocabulary testing, we'll probably have a very significant bias for socioeconomic, a socioeconomic bias. So just so you know, with that, labeling, identifying, and naming objects and body parts, I assessed all these tests that we all use, is the most tested skill across domains. The most tested skill across domains for the developmental specialists, for the OTs even, and for the SLPs. Pretty scary, given that we're just talking there about socioeconomic bias. Now, one of the things that we look at is sociolinguistics. How are children brought up to communicate and to learn? And in some cultures, it's all about the child. It's very child-directed. I'm going to show you a video of a little boy, Henry, who was in my living room, and his dad is a chef, and his mom is a theatrical agent, and you can see how child-directed this family is.
And he's making dinner.
Yeah, because he does like to cook a lot, right, Mom?
Want to make some soup?
Yeah.
Oh,
Never
I
mind
love
about
soup.
the knives.
And let's make some dinner.
He's going to make some soup.
Never mind about the knives because they're not special.
Oh boy.
Daddy's going to make soup with Henry?
We're gonna make some soup. Oh, what do we have in the soup? Miss soup. We're making soup.
So as you can see from this video with Henry, it's all child-centered. Now I want to tell you how that changes, not just socioeconomically, but generationally. So when I was a kid, it was adult-centered culture. I'm from mainstream American middle-class school-oriented culture, from birth up through when I went to college, I guess, over my whole life. And in my culture, and when the parents had a party, my brother and I could come down with canapes and our little fancy little dresses and walk around to the adults, and the adults would say how sweet we are or whatever. But then that was just a short period of time. Then we were sent upstairs and we looked through the banister at the adults in their high shoes and so exciting. It looked like so much smoking, of course, drinking, having such a wonderful time with music, Frank Sinatra in the background. It was adult-centered. We were on the outs. My daughter, who's now 21, Caitlin, when she was born, it was a child-centered, and it remains child-centered within my own culture. Whether it's adult-centered or child-centered has shifted over time. But let's look at some of the tests. We're going to see that in a minute. So you may say, but how can developmental milestones be biased? Dr. Crowley, you're being silly. So I'm just going to look at a couple of items in the Gard, Gillam, and Gorman. Points to 1 to 3 body parts on command. Says bye-bye. Now let me tell you, not every culture in New York City has bye-bye, hi, thank you, please, as a mark of a well-developed child. In my culture it is. And everybody's going to think the kid's better off if they say that. One of my graduate assistants is from Boston. His parents are from Argentina. And his sister was brought up speaking Spanish, went to preschool, and father's a doctor. The sister is just graduating this weekend from the University of Pennsylvania. Very highly educated family and high SES. So his sister went to preschool, and the teachers brought the girl's mom in, and she said, we have a problem with your daughter. She's not really good socially. She doesn't understand what to do socially. And the mom said, well, what are you talking about? She's fantastic. She said, well, she doesn't say please and thank you to the kids. She just said, give me the spoon. And the mom said, well, in Spanish, we don't do that. We don't add these thank yous and please all over the place. It's cultural, yet we're assessing it as if it's a developmental milestone. Waves bye-bye, plays patty cake, cultural. Produces animal sounds. Part of my culture, not part of every culture. Says, what's that? In many cultures, it's inappropriate for a child to engage an adult by saying, what's that? Acknowledges, gives good eye contact, vocally responds or repeats a word said. Again, this is all cultural. Listens to a 10-minute story, repeats this is all prior experiences. This bothers me because we're talking about not just sociolinguistics and developmental milestones, but the last 4 items, plural forms, in, on, correctly, and contractions and irregular past tense, are all obligatory features of standard American English, one dialect of English used in New York City, but not obligatory features of most West Indian dialects, of most of African American English, of Spanish influenced English, of Chinese influenced English. So right there, you're moving directly into linguistic biases. This is a test. It's not even a test. It's a sheet on the wall that people use. Then we go much further into basically looking at morphology, which is the least interesting, and it's morphology in standard American English. So right away, you're dealing with issues of linguistic bias for a vast number of children in New York City. Matches colors, hugely biased culturally. If you want to learn more about what I just mentioned about those biases, here's free ASHA CEUs at leadersproject.org, and I hope every SLP understands about these issues. So let's look at some of the bias issues. So here's what I did. I looked at the tests that we use, the DAISY, the ELAP, the Bayley, the Brigance, the HELP, the REAL. Do all children have the same exposure to books? They don't. Many of us we evaluators go into the homes and do the evaluations right there, and we see there's virtually no books in the home. Yet many of our both motor and cognitive and linguistic tests are based on prior exposure to books. Now, one of them has to do with turning the pages of a book. It's a motor skill, turning the pages of a book. So you're looking at these hardcover books, right? The baby books that are every page is a hardcover, essentially, thick cardboard. So what are you looking at? Well, of course, you're looking at whether they can grasp and turn their wrist. How else might you be able to do that if the child doesn't have exposure to hardbound books? Well, of course, you could have the baby turn a blanket, or turn something else, a toy that they're using, that they're used to using. Anything, a blanket would be the best thing, turn anything. Instead, we're assuming the child has all this exposure to books, and of course, if they can't turn the book page, it means that they haven't acquired what they've already been exposed to when they haven't been exposed to it. So we're going to look now at a 2-month-old. This is a wonderful little baby, 2 months, 2 weeks old. And you'll see the variability of exposure to books by looking at how much this little baby is exposed to books by her doting and adoring grandfather.
And then, do not be fooled by scary names. This dragonfly is really tame. Look at those wings. There are wings there on the dragonfly.
So you can see from this video, the little baby is engaging in that verbal play at 2 months, 12 days old with the grandfather, and the grandfather's got the book out. You can be sure by the time that child, I doubt this child is going to need EI services, but by the time that child is assessed for cognition or language, that child is going to be way off the charts because their prior experiences, that child's prior experiences were so rich in terms of preparing them for the test. What about sharing social routines? I mentioned this briefly before. Waves in response to bye-bye. It's a big thing in my culture. Bye-bye, raise your hand, bye-bye, thank you, please. But in many cultures, we just don't do it. Hugs and kisses, parents. When we say bye-bye, can you say hi to Grandpa? Look, says bye-bye, says hi and thank you, please. Remember the story of Marcos' sister. All of this is very much assuming that every child is inculcated in the social routines of the culture, the dominant culture, mainstream American middle-class school-learned culture. I mean, that, I don't know if it's dominant anymore, but when these tests were created, it certainly was. How about all children engage in adult-child interactions? You saw the video of Henry. I have other videos of children where it's the parents that are the ones who are the dominants. Adult-adult interaction that matters, as opposed to child. So they'll participate in games with adults. They'll play a fetching game. Go get this. They want to be near adults. I've spent a lot of time in Africa, and mostly, once the babies are past nursing stage, for the most part, they're cared for by their siblings or their cousins or their extended family. They play ball with adults. I have great parents. None of my parents sat down and played a fetching game with me, or played ball with me, or played even games on the floor with me. Yet we assume that that's going to happen. I did not grow up in a adult impoverished household. I grew up in a household that adult interactions were important and child interactions were important, but that connection was not something we do. My parents would read to me, my parents would do things with me, take me places, but getting on the floor and play was not it. Yet we assume in these tests, and we're looking at the Rossetti with the ELAP right here. There's so many examples of this, but I just happen to choose these. We're looking at these examples and we're saying, why do they assume that every kid has those same experiences? Now I'd like to show you a video I made in Casamance, Senegal. And I was in this village and I was looking for the children. Where were the children? I found them in this little hut. They were actually all peer-to-peer interaction, and they were working with each other to learn the traditional dance of that region, which is clapping with blocks and jumping as fast as you can. It's a competitive jumping. The adults do it. These kids didn't have permission to do it with the adults, but peer-to-peer, they were learning this activity. So as you can see with the children in this Casamance, who are great kids, wonderful, exciting experiences, there's not a single experience in that hut that's going to be assessed on the test that we're using in EI. Let's think about the bias areas. So in a recent EI evaluation, in the summary, it says, since a child's neither language nor culture affects physical, social, or adaptive behaviors, the DAISY-2 was used for these three areas, and standardized scores and deviations were reported. Okay. Now the question is that a true statement? Were physical, social, or adaptive behaviors never be affected by language or culture? Well, we certainly know that's not true by that little 13-month-old who could use that thin needle to thread those little teeny beads. Imagine if we were assessing fine motor skills by having the kids do that. All that would be was a reflection of that Karen Thai culture being the culture that was reflected in the tests. Now let's have a look. So certainly language and culture affects physical. What about, does the child use a spoon to self-feed? Well, just want you to know that the Bronx is the second largest city of Ghanaians in the world after the capital, Accra. So you're going to see a lot of kids from Ghana in the Bronx. Many of you do already. I know there's a lot of African kids being evaluated through EI. What about a spoon to self-feed? Well, we all know if you're cultured, if you're raised well, you use a spoon. But of course that's not true, right? Because in many cultures you learn how to feed with your hands. And when I was in Ghana, it was so interesting working with kids with intellectual disabilities. One of the things they have to do is make sure those kids learn which hand to use. Because in Ghana, you use the right hand to feed and you use the left hand to clean yourself. So here's a picture of three of us, our guide Kwaku, who clearly knew how to eat, see the banku or fufu, with the stew. He's doing a great job. Miriam, my friend and colleague, Miriam Bagori, doesn't know how to do it, but she's using what she knows culturally to make a spoon to feed herself. And of course, I'm trying very hard. However, if you notice, my left hand is on the table, which is a total violation of a taboo, right? So none of us are doing, neither Miriam nor I are doing feeding right. Yet when we see these kids, and that's true, many Indian populations do not use spoons to feed. They use their hands in different ways. So if you would please think about that when you're saying, do they have the ADL skills? Do they actually do this? What about this? Does the child have good social skills? I went to a naming ceremony in northern Senegal, and they had this bowl out. They brought this bowl, because they always feed people when you arrive at a village. And I looked at it and I thought, oh my gosh, am I really going to eat that? How do I eat this? What do I do? Of course, I learned by watching people. But if you had sat down and said, before I could learn, show me how to eat from this, I really would not know that you take a piece of bread and you scoop it up and you just eat in your little corner. And it looks hard. For me, it looked horrible, but it actually was ground roasted millet with fresh cow's milk yogurt with sugar in it, and was one of the most delicious things I've ever had. Again, if you saw me learn how to do it, it would be different. And I don't mean by giving a spoon to a kid in the middle of an evaluation. That's not how you learn, and then you test them on it. But if you'd watched me learn, but static assessment, I would have failed my good social skills. Here's how you do it. It's an amazing experience to sit in a bowl and eat with strangers and share a meal with each other. It's a beautiful, beautiful experience. What about the assumption that we have in many of our tests? Look, Gard, Gilliman, Gorman, a language test, assumes that all children have blocks and that children can place one block after another on a table. A language test? The HELP, one block on top of another without balancing. The Bayley takes toys, blocks out of a cup. The ELAP holds 3 cubes, builds a tower of 3, 18 months, 5 to 6, 21 months. I mean, come on, this is so ridiculous. The ELAP, every block you put up, you go another couple of 2 months, 3 months. Builds a tower using 2, 3, 6 cubes. This is block city, both for cognition, for motor, and for communication. How could that be? Let's look at the kind of exposure kids can get to blocks. This is my daughter, Caitlin, when she was 30 months old. Now, in my house, we happen to have tons of blocks. We're the kind of family that when she made her an installation, we would call them, we would play with her. It became a game, and she would play, for a couple of days. We'd leave it up in the middle of the living room. Child-centered household, I told you. So now you're going to have a look at Caitlin and her exposure to blocks.
She took a bite.
Yeah?
She took it here. It tastes good. Orange, do you like it? And here. Apple. I want to go into park. Dinosaur can stand up or lay down, and I'm going to meet them here. I'm going to meet them there. Yeah, I'm going to meet them. Here's a blue Ceratops. A blue one.
Oh, really? What'd you say?
This is a fancy part. It's a design. This is how we designed it.
Okay.
I go to one, it's around, and then it comes through here, and then it goes back up.
Wonderful design.
Yeah. It's not a design, it's a part.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's a beautiful park.
Yeah.
So my daughter there's a private school. We thought about sending her to this private school in the village called City and Country. And City and Country is focused on block building, and they're kindergarten through 8th grade. Yeah, through 8th grade, I believe, or maybe 6th grade. And we, in New York City, you have to bring your kid, and they get interviewed, and they get a test. And so the way City and Country tested is they had the kids, maybe 6 kids, and the parents were all standing behind, highly anxious, and the teachers, and they watched the kids. Well, my daughter, she went right to the blocks. She was like, oh my gosh, look at these blocks. And she built this beautiful filigree of a thing that built up, and she was putting the blocks at the very top. She did this beautiful, beautiful job. Why? Because she was so familiar with blocks. Now, these are all parents that are ready to send their kid to a private school in New York City. And the parents turned to me and my husband and said, so just let me ask you, did you prep her for this? And they were joking, but the answer was actually yes. Not intentionally. We didn't know what City and Country was going to do. But in fact, just because of her background, she was miles ahead of those kids who didn't have that kind of block. I'm sure most of them had blocks and puzzles and all kinds of stuff. But when we're thinking about blocks, with all those items that looked at whether a kid can do blocks, we are bringing a static assessment in and identifying disability based on a very static approach to exposure. How about exposure and experience with certain toys? This blew me away. The help, the Bayley, the help, the ELAP. They're all interested in using form boards and pegboards. Truthfully, my daughter had form boards and pegboards. Why? I'm not really sure. She got it from some birthday party, from my mom, whatever. I don't know. But there's so many things about doing pegboards. And really, if you don't have these kind of things in your home, you're not going to do that well. We may want to work with them in therapy if you're a motor person or a cognitive person, but I'm sure there's other ways of doing it because this is so absolutely disconnected from most child's true experiences. It just happens in my house. Not only do we have a bunch of blocks, we have puzzles. And we had puzzles starting with the first one where you hold it like this and you lift it off and it's one piece, to when we go on vacation with the extended family, we bring at least a 500, sometimes 1,000 piece puzzle that everybody does, and the little ones get to use the corners. So my daughter would do great on this, as she does. Well, certainly when she was little. She doesn't play with them now. But again, we're bringing in test items that are consistent with the experiences of some children that we're assessing, but inconsistent with the experiences of many. So I took some pictures when I was in Senegal in January of the kind of toys. There were very few toys in Senegal, and you go into most of the kids' homes where we work, and there's very few toys. But there were some cool toys that kids had made. This kid used like the bottom of a flip-flop to create a taxi, a traditional taxi. This boy, I said, what's that? It looked like nothing to me. It was a boat. And then when I saw the boats, I said, wow, it looks a lot like the boat. This boy made out of clay, he made a little car. And then this, of course, took a sock and filled it with sand, and it became a ball. So now, but one thing I've been thinking of, kids grow up with so many different experiences, but now I think more and more young children share the same experiences, sitting with an iPad in their hand, often learning colors, numbers, shapes, the ABCs. I have parents come up to me, my daughter, she's only 3 and she can do the ABCs, or 2, he knows his colors. Well, if you spend 6 hours a day doing that, I would hope so. What the difference in socioeconomically is these kids kids from different socioeconomic backgrounds have different experiences outside of that, right? And some families don't even let their kids use it. But a lot of kids are sitting down, clicking screens. So because of the problem with tests, as I've shown you, the biases, socioeconomic bias, the cultural biases, the assumption of prior experiences that is so flawed, informed clinical opinion is extremely important in EI evaluations, and that's why it's in the federal law, the state regs, and the New York City guidance. This concludes Part 1 of Module 2, The Problem with Current Tests. In Part 2, we will delve deeper into test misuse.